So there's a few different scenarios where you might want to consider tapering slowly off of cannabis versus outright quitting cold turkey. And in today's video, I'm going to tell you what those scenarios are, and then I'm going to share with you some methods that you can use to slowly wean off cannabis if stopping cold turkey hasn't worked for you. Now look, I have helped thousands of people overcome addiction to nicotine, cannabis, stimulants, and other substances. So if you need help with that, be sure to check out the link in the video description or the pinned comment to learn more about our one-on-one coaching programs. Scenarios where you would want to taper off cannabis typically involve a high level of physical dependency to the substance. And the top three common things that I see when I'm dealing with this with people would number one be insomnia. So this is where a person is quitting using cannabis and they have horrible insomnia, and maybe they have horrible PTSD related dreams because they have some history of trauma or something along those lines. When a person is quitting cannabis, it is important that they eventually get some sleep, because not sleeping at all for a period of 3, 4, 5 days can cause you to lose your mind, and it can actually trigger a state of psychosis or manic behavior or delusions or any number of bad things that can happen when a person doesn't sleep. Did you know the only thing they won't let you do in the Guinness Book World of Records is deprive yourself of sleep? That's how important sleep is, okay? You can do almost anything else in that book. So in extreme cases of insomnia, I'll typically recommend that the person tapers off of cannabis. Now, most cases with people quitting, people just become a lighter sleeper. They're up, but they're getting a few hours of sleep. I'm talking like the extreme cases of insomnia. And if that's happening during the taper, there should be an effort to try and rule out other lifestyle factors or conditions that might be resulting in the insomnia. So if you have insomnia, do you also have chronic pain? Have you ever been checked for sleep apnea? Do you have PTSD? And is your brain dumping adrenaline and norepinephrine while you're sleeping at night? We need to consider why a person has insomnia, even if they're tapering. Maybe it's lifestyle related. Maybe you don't exercise a lot. Maybe you're drinking caffeine throughout the day and abusing nicotine products and other stimulants. Or maybe you're prescribed amphetamines. We need to understand why the insomnia exists, but in that case, a taper might be warranted. Another common thing that I'll see is pretty extreme gastrointestinal issues. In some cases, it can be diarrhea. In some cases, it can be constipation, okay? More often than not, if I'm going to do tapering, it's because the person is super, super constipated. And if over-the-counter laxatives fail, this is assuming we ruled out other gastrointestinal problems, then we might want to consider a taper just to give their gastrointestinal system time to start making its own endocannabinoids again, because that endocannabinoid system plays a huge role in GI function, in digestion, and bowel movement patterns. So in cases of extreme constipation, which can result in an ER visit, we might want to consider a taper. Or if there's just like super extreme nausea, maybe there's some vomiting during the withdrawal stages. But I want to throw out a huge word of caution, because if it is nausea and maybe vomiting that you're dealing with, that might be a syndrome called Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome. And if that's what you're experiencing, then you should be stopping cannabis cold turkey. You should not be consuming cannabis in any circumstances. So it's really important that we're differentiating between a clinical condition, Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome, caused from consuming cannabis, or extreme symptoms of cannabis detox and withdrawal that might be mitigated through tapering. Because one of them, you have to stop cold turkey. The other one, a taper might help you out. Now, the last scenario that I'll see when I usually would recommend a taper would be as if someone's entering into a state of mental health crisis, like extreme anhedonia. Or I can tie this into it, if a person is dealing with extreme physical pain. usually before having that person stop fully, we would want to start to address some of the other lifestyle factors or stressors that the person's dealing with in order to help them quit eventually successfully after doing microdoses or tapering on their way to quitting. Extreme anhedonia can lead to suicidal ideation. So can continued cannabis substance use, though, by the way. And extreme chronic pain in an individual can be unbearable to live with. And in some of those cases, considering a taper or considering a higher CBD to THC ratio or looking at other cannabinoids, phytocannabinoids like CBG, CBN, CBD, this might be warranted. Last scenario that I forgot to mention is if we're seeing changes in cardiac function. So some people will quit cold turkey and they'll get really erratic spikes in their blood pressure, in their heart rate, and they might actually get super rapid heart rate, which can actually lead to anxiety and even panic attacks. And then what naturally in these cases usually winds up happening is the person goes back to using cannabis anyways because they couldn't handle this symptom of detox and withdrawal with this increased heart rate, because your cardiovascular system has a ton of endocannabinoid receptors on it. So in a case like that, we might want to look into using other cannabinoids, phytocannabinoids, or we might want to consider a taper and potentially even bridging that with your primary care physician or a cardiologist with potentially like a beta blocker style medication. And you would talk to them about that. I would offer guidance on that, okay? So those are the scenarios. Now, once we're tapering with a person, how is it that we actually successfully taper? Okay, so option number one would be just to simply reduce the frequency. And a lot of people watching this video are probably struggling with a cannabis addiction or substance use disorder like I once did. And you might be saying to yourself, that's impossible. It's impossible for me to reduce the frequency. I'm an addict. If I have one, I have to have 1,000. If you feel that way and that's a problem for you, you need to book that call with that link in the video description, because your mindset is not where it needs to be to do this successfully. Now, if you can do that, that's one option of tapering. Simply reduce the frequency of use. Now, another option that we can do with tapering is we could reduce the strength. We could aim for lower concentrations of THC and higher concentrations of CBD. So we could reduce the strength of what we're consuming. Option number 3 is reducing both the strength and the frequency of consumption. So it's combining options 1 and 2. Each of those things, or a combination of those things, over a few weeks, maybe 4 to 6 weeks time, is an effective way to taper off of cannabis. Again, this is with the exception of someone who's struggling with psychosis, we want to stop, or someone who has cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. We just outright, no more cannabis, we don't want to mess with it anymore, okay? But going back to tapering, you would implement 1 or 3 of those combinations typically over a course of I'll say 2 to 6 weeks to play it safe. And for most people, that will be effective, because what's happening is as you start to taper the cannabis and your body's tolerance starts to go down, eventually your body's going to start to recognize that your own endocannabinoid system has to start making its own cannabinoids again. So as you're tapering, your tolerance is going down and your body's getting revved up to start making its own cannabinoids again, okay? You could also consider a taper to be using, strictly CBD products, maybe CBG, CBN products for sleep or something like that. But what we don't want to do in the taper is switch to products like Delta 8 or Delta 10 products or THC acetate or THCO. We don't want to do that. We're trying to get away from Delta 9 and anything that has a psychedelic type effect to it, okay? And trust me, Delta 8 has a very psychedelic effect Delta 8 is the product that I get a lot of calls for, especially from young males who have been hospitalized multiple times for psychosis and suicidal ideation and extreme anhedonia. So we don't want to taper with a substitute Delta 9 product. That's not, Delta 8, Delta 10, THC acetate. We do not want to do that. Now, the only other thing you could consider in a taper, but you have to be very careful if you're going to do this, is when you're using a lower concentration of THC, you're switching the mode of delivery to start to break that habit pattern. So if you're used to hitting carts all day long, which a lot of those, that's a whole nother story. Black market garbage products is what most of them are. But if that's what you're used to doing all day long, maybe you would have benefit switching to a really low milligram edible as kind of like a time release thing throughout the day. But just be aware, if you haven't done edibles before, edibles have the highest instance of hospitalization related to a mental health crisis. If you're doing dabs and dab carts, maybe switching to a dry herb vaporizer with a lower concentration of dry herb, maybe a higher concentration CBD to THC ratio would be an effective way for you to taper. Maybe using a tincture from a reputable brand would be a way for you to taper. So we could also look at switching up the mode of delivery while we're reducing the frequency, the potency, or that combination of frequency and potency. For most people, when it comes to tapering, it's not the methodology of how you're going to do it that's the problem. It's the mindset. Most people who are struggling with a cannabis substance use disorder, just like I once did, don't believe that they're capable of reducing usage slowly. Most people who are struggling with an addiction identify as an addict, some out of control animal that has no rational impulse control and has no rational reasoning on how to do things. And that is so far from the truth. Very little of cannabis addiction actually has to do with cannabis. Addiction largely lives inside our heads. It's a mindset. And until we break that mindset, until we understand it, tapering, quitting cold turkey, taking a tolerance break for a period of time, it's all going to be hard. But once you understand that addiction is all about your perspective, your perceived value of benefit in using the substance, right? Once you understand that, quitting cold turkey or tapering or weaning off just becomes infinitely easier. At least it was for me, and that's certainly the case for literally thousands of other people that I have helped successfully quit cannabis in our one-on-one coaching programs. So if you need help with that, if you're a high-performance person, if you know that you could be doing better, if you're not living up to your full potential, and you're having a hard time making sense of all this stuff, check out that link in the video description. Last thing, some people, they just need accountability when they're tapering. A little bit of accountability and support can go an extraordinarily long way. Something that I wish I had when I was going through my journey of becoming recovered from a cannabis substance use disorder. Until next time.